You were venturing out into territory that you're not supposed to by some standards. And so did you meet a lot of resistance in this process, or kind of describe that sociologically perhaps?
Yeah, let's give a little metaphor. The resistance was as if I was encountering a snowstorm that was wielded by human beings who wanted me to stop.
Hi Cass, welcome to Zurich.
Great pleasure to be here.
Good to meet you. I'm very excited to talk to you today. I think you just flew in from the US, is that correct?
I did.
All right. Did you get some sleep?
I got a lot of sleep on a very comfortable flight.
Okay, great, excellent. So, you've been one of the most prolific scholars, I think, over the last 20 years. And there are many things I want to talk to you about, but I got very excited to see you have actually two recent books. Imperfect Oracle, what AI can and cannot do, which is very thought-provoking, I thought, and I want to get into that. AI is something I do research on myself, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and try to have social impact. You also have another book on liberalism in defense of freedom. I don't think we'll have enough time to go into both books. What I wanted to talk to you about, though, is sort of the evolution of the ideas you've been pursuing, right? And if we start like in 2026 with your latest book, which is hot off the presses, I think it was actually quite hard to get it. I had to order it from the UK. You talk about AI, but a lot of the book is actually about humans, I think, and behavioral economics. And in many ways, that's the core of the book, and then you go into AI. Is that a fair assessment?
That's completely right. It's a behavioral economics book that is also about AI.
Great. And so I actually want to play back the tape a little bit, right? Because the book you wrote, was it 2008? Nudge is sort of became an instant classic, right? And at that time, right, like, so you came from law, right? And you ventured into behavioral economics, and you wrote this book with Thaler. Can you talk to me a little bit about the years leading up to that? Like, what did you see in law, let's say, that made you sort of embrace psychology and behavioral economics in sort of the years leading up to that book? Talk to me about that.
Thank you for that. I started at the University of Chicago, where there were giants, people who were extremely tall, taller than any human beings on the planet, and they had Nobel Prizes, and they were fierce, and they could bite like a lion, and they had a theory of the world, which is human beings are rational actors who are profit maximizers, highly responsive to incentives. And I thought, surrounded by these heroic figures, and I was very small, I thought that they were wrong. I had studied literature in college and knew about novels and plays, and I thought humanity was more complicated than that, and that rationality was imperfect. And I noticed that, giant as they were, when they played tennis, they would often make poor choices. They would hit very hard shots, which they had no business hitting. I noticed that some of them were...
Overconfidence, perhaps?
They were overconfident, and they maybe used the availability heuristic, where they did one good shot and they tried over and over again. That they were maybe in divorces, which weren't going particularly well. And so I started writing some papers about rationality and its limits with respect to law. And the reason law is relevant is if you have contractual disputes, how are people going to interact with one another when they are terminating their relationship? If you have an environmental regulation or regulation that's designed to protect workers from danger, how will workers respond to the regulations, and why would the regulations be needed? Is the standard economic theory of market failure an adequate account? And as I was writing these papers, I was a little bit on fire, but I lacked the tools because I'd studied literature and not psychology or economics. And someone said to me I should read this young Cornell professor named Thaler. And I thought it was Thaylor, and I couldn't find the papers. But eventually I found his work, and that led me to Kahneman and Tversky. And I started exploring imperfect rationality, pre-commitment strategies, the fact that people's preferences may be a product of the law rather than the law being a product of preferences, and how that would bear on our tort law, our regulatory apparatus. And eventually Thaler came to Chicago and we became fast friends and we had lunch a lot, and that is what culminated in Nudge.
Did you play tennis with him?
I did. Now, he was a very exuberant tennis player and a joyful tennis player. And let's just say his strategies in tennis reflected the same phenomena that he uncovered in his early years as a behavioral economist.
Wonderful. So when you look at the, let me start here. What was the reception inside of law? Right? Because you were venturing out into territory that you're not supposed to by some standards. And so did you meet a lot of resistance in this process, or kind of describe that sociologically perhaps?
Yeah, let's give a little metaphor. The resistance was as if I was encountering a snowstorm that was wielded by human beings who wanted me to stop. So at the University of Chicago, it was all very, professional and not cruel. But people said this is a terrible line of work, that the underlying research is not up to standards, that it's basically surveys of undergraduates. People said, and on the basis of that, you're making generalizations about market behavior and human beings. So at the University of Chicago, this was very poorly received. And there was actually a moment that has a claim to being slightly historic when Thaler and I and a colleague gave an early paper at the University of Chicago Law School with the giants in the room, and they responded with a lot of emotion to the paper they didn't like. And it was a little amusing because their response wasn't purely rational. You could tell that their emotions were going.
How ironic.
And it was a very difficult session. And the claim was the work we were doing was unscientific. Clearly the thought was that it would unsettle some hard-won wisdom about market failures and about rationality. We spoke about loss aversion and the endowment effect, and that the legal rule might set an entitlement and that would affect preferences. We spoke about consumer behavior and how people might be engaged in mental accounting or might be present biased and make poor choices in terms of their long-term welfare. And these ideas were received as dangerous. And it was very thrilling for me to see the energy in the room. But I've heard even in recent years, this was decades ago, from people who were there, maybe as students, maybe as young faculty members, that it's a moment they'll never forget just because of the charge in the disagreement between the old guard, as I think of them, and as the young Turks, as I think of the authors of that paper.
So this was a specific seminar?
Yeah, it was a specific seminar.
You want to name names?
Yeah, so Richard Posner was there and he was extremely displeased. Gary Becker was there, he didn't like it at all. I'm not sure if George Stigler was there at that moment, but he was there at a paper I gave in basically the same time period. And George Stigler, who was a great man and actually very tall, he was very harsh. And I remember he said to me, I was talking about pre-commitment strategies, and people trying to respond to their own imperfect rationality and how law might embody pre-commitment strategy. He said, this reminds me of some of the things that John Stuart Mill said, and he said, and what you're saying is almost as stupid as what Mill said. And it was funny And it was in a way a little bit softened because Mill is, of course, a great figure.
Yeah.
But there was no doubt that he was treating Mill as unscientific and someone from a previous generation of error-prone people, and we were beyond them. And now his younger colleague, me, was going back to Mill's foolishness.
Okay, very interesting. I have two follow-ups. You mentioned John Stuart Mill, and it seems like you come back to some characters in multiple books. Maybe I'm overfitting here. John Stuart Mill, Friedrich Hayek is someone you mentioned in the most recent book, and John Rawls. Are those, let's take Mill, is that a scholar that you... So what's your relationship to Mill? And you have a book called On Liberalism. That's why this is a little bit of a detour, right? So can you just talk about that quickly?
Yeah, Mill is a hero of mine, though he's also a sparring partner. So Mill's Subjection of Women, I think, is one of the great books of the last however many years. And
that book is mentioned in this Imperfect Oracle book. Which is, I think, very interesting. It's very thought-provoking. You're taking things in a slightly different direction. Okay, please continue.
So Mill's concerned about preference formation and the ways that an existing order can form preferences in a way that might reduce welfare. So that, I think, is very important. He was very good on it. On Liberalism, I think, is an equally great book. But Mill fundamentally made an epistemic argument for the harm principle, which is that the individual knows better than anyone else what will promote that individual's well-being. And that's an empirical claim. And I think it's like a shining star in the sky, Mill's harm principle, but it's not correct. So that my University of Chicago colleagues often made, with respect to tennis, choices which were worse than the choices outsiders would have made for them. And consumers often are making choices that are not promoting their well-being for one or another reason. And this is true of people who enter into contracts of multiple kinds. It's true of people in the family. Now, we wouldn't want to go wild with this, so Thaler and I are libertarian paternalists rather than coercive paternalists, and that's a very complicated matter, actually. Thaler and I are alert to. But Mill's harm principle, I come back to it over and over again because it's a formidable foundation for markets, for free societies, and it's not quite right.
Okay, great. So to come back to that epic seminar, so Becker, Stiegler, Posner were there. And so, Becker, Stiegler, economics of crime, sort of thinking about incentives mattering. And presumably you were not refuting that idea, saying that incentives don't matter, monetary incentives, that is. But you were venturing away from rationality, a full embrace of rationality. So, and that was the core tension, correct?
Yes. So Becker's central theme is that people are rationally responsive to incentives. And I would like to put some question marks next to that, that if people don't know the incentives because they're not salient, then people might be unresponsive to them. That if you, with respect to crime, have a very severe punishment that is infrequently enforced, that may or may not have the same impact as a less severe policy that's frequently enforced. The expected value calculation, which Becker thinks people engage in, might be not what people engage in. It might be, and there's empirical work on this, that a small, frequently enforced fine has a bigger impact than a large, infrequently enforced fine, or vice versa. There's, I think, no a priori reason to choose one or the other. But the claim that expected value is the core of the incentive, that's an empirical claim, which probably isn't true.
Okay, great. And so that led eventually to the book Nudge. And is it fair to say that there were two key concepts that you introduced? One is libertarian paternalism that, as far as I understand, was coined with Thaler or by Thaler, and the other one was choice architecture. Those, at least to me, that's kind of how.
Yeah.
That's what's available in my, heuristic brain right now. Are those the two core ideas of that book? And if so, can you just briefly explain those concepts?
Yeah. So the libertarian paternalist idea grew out of an early paper we did with an economist named Christine Joles, which we ended with a section on anti-paternalism. So our central claim was that anti-paternalism has a problem, which is that it may rule out of bounds welfare improving interventions. And we didn't want to say we were pro-paternalism, but we were anti-paternalism. That evolved into the specific idea of libertarian paternalism, where you have interventions which are freedom preserving, which don't alter incentives, but that have a steering quality on the part of the person who's responsible for them. So if you go to the grocery store and there's something that says this contains shrimp, that is very mildly paternalistic. It's a form of paternalism. But if you want to get something that has shrimp, maybe because you like shrimp and you're not allergic to it, you are welcome to do that. A GPS device is a form of libertarian paternalism that you get to decide where you want to go. And you can also disregard the indicated route, thinking that you want something that's prettier or that's more familiar. But it does paternalistically assert this is the best way to get to your own preferred destination. Websites frequently have libertarian paternalism in them. There'll be a menu of options. The ones that are at the beginning, maybe, or that are the largest font, are ones that the choice architect, and we'll get to that in a moment, thinks is in your best interest, if it's an altruistic choice architect, or thinks that it's in its best interest, so it can be paternalistically steering you to part with some of your money for its own purposes. Governments can use libertarian paternalism to promote worker safety. Hospitals can be libertarian paternalists. In fact, they frequently are, to get people to take medicines they're supposed to take, which is a very serious problem all over the world, that people die because they don't take the medicines they're supposed to take. And a libertarian paternalist might say, we're not going to put you in jail if you don't take your medicine, but we're going to use a reminder or some kind of architecture of, let's say, the pillbox, so that you are more likely to take the medicine than you otherwise would be. Now notice that an economic incentive, like a tax or a fine or a subsidy, would not be libertarian paternalism. It might be great, but it would have a material incentive, which is more Beckerian, though it might be that the material incentive has a behavioral foundation. It might be responding to the fact that people are present biased, or people are poor risk assessors, and this is why the incentive is imposed. For, like, a smoking tax could have a behavioral foundation. So libertarian paternalism's all around. Companies engage in libertarian paternalism, so do governments. The libertarian paternalist enterprise has gone viral. I work with the World Bank and the United Nations, and even now, I mean, probably more now than ever, libertarian paternalism is part of the toolkit used to reduce poverty, to protect against environmental degradation, to promote economic growth, to make sure operations work better. Now, choice architecture is a different idea. And this actually grew out of a book by Don Norman called The Design of Everyday Things, which says that some things are kind of suitable for intuitions, like this glass is pretty good. I'm not confused about how to hold it, but you could design a glass that would be very puzzling for me, and maybe the likelihood that I'd spill would be increased dramatically. A door or a stove or a microwave oven can have a design that fits with people's intuitions or not. And so the idea that Norman helped spur was that there's a choice architecture all around. So if you go in a store, it will have an architecture and a choice architecture. There will be some things that are highly visible when you enter. They might be chocolate candy. They might be very expensive items promoting impulse buying, or it might be their healthy things, or they're things that people really need to pay attention to but are not inclined to unless they're right in their face. A website has a choice architecture behind it, and people who are, very determined to do well economically test empirically various choice architectures to see what the impact of one or another design is. So choice architecture is everywhere. It's not avoidable. The weather is part of choice architecture, even though it's not typically at least designed by human beings, that on cold days people might buy certain kinds of cars or certain kinds of clothing because it's cold out. We have data suggesting that on sunny days, when people visit universities, young people, they're more likely to go to that place on a sunny day. So universities pray for good weather when they want to get the students they've admitted. If it's terrible weather, they're less likely to come. Now that's part of choice architecture. What Thaler and I are particularly concerned with is choice architectures that inadvertently reduce people's welfare, or maybe intentionally on the part of the choice architect steer people in a direction that makes them have shorter and worse lives.
Yeah, so let's dive into that a little bit, because we're talking quite abstractly right now, but these have been ideas that have become very powerful, and we have nudge units in governments, and you've been working with them. But then on the, let's say on the company side or the firm side, right? You mentioned that companies can engage in libertarian paternalism. But one concern, or this is more, let's say, an intuition I have or hypothesis, is that in MBA programs and let's say in companies, they read this kind of work and they see, wow, this is actually, we can with the small little subtle tweaks, direct people to make choices in a certain way. And clearly, if I'm just profit maximizing, and if we're now deviating away from the rationalist assumption that choices equals preferences and therefore welfare, companies can exploit this, right? And then couple that with like big data, couple that with like A/B testing. You can. It's not a very it's pretty immediate that you could basically exploit this, right? And so, but companies wouldn't necessarily make that very public. So that's why I'm saying it's more of a hypothesis. Like, what is your sense of the extent to which markets have, or market forces or companies have learned to exploit, perhaps partly based on these ideas, sort of consumers, basically?
It's a tremendous development, and companies all over the world either have been very well educated in behavioral economics or have intuitions based on what they read that are pretty reasonable and that they are deploying. So I'll give you one happy example. I think it's a happy example. There's a very large soft drink company, I'm not going to name it for reasons that will emerge, that is keenly interested in promoting healthier choices on the part of consumers. And they don't want to become a health food company, they're a soft drink company. But they offer, excuse me for a moment, they offer food and drink that they want to be a little healthier than what the market has produced. And they want to do that while being an economic giant. And they hired a group of which I was the kind of informal lead to help them on that, to promote healthier choices on the part of consumers. And they've had significant success in moving markets in Europe and North America and elsewhere for their products in healthier directions. Now, not the directions that a doctor or a health food expert would think are ideal, but everyone would agree that's an improvement.
Like Pareto improving, the firm does better,
Yeah.
the consumers do better.
Yeah, well, the consumers are better. The company might have taken an economic loss, not a serious one, but it might have done a little less well than it would have done if it had focused solely on promoting sales. So they have a conscience. They want healthier choices. So that I think I admire that company. In Silicon Valley, there is great awareness of the behavioral material. So if you think of your preferred companies, chances are very high they either have experts or they have people who engage with experts or have people who have working knowledge at least. So Meta, let's name names, Meta and Google and X, they have had, I know, people who know either a fair bit or a great deal about behavioral economics. Instagram is a very controversial company, but they've had a bunch of initiatives to ensure that teenagers aren't spending all their time on Instagram. I think this is an admirable set of steps where they've been using nudges, they even call them nudges, to try to encourage young people to get off at night, to have default rules where they're not going to be on all the time. And there are a series of, I think, very promising steps to square their product, which of course they are proud of, with the well-being of young people.
So that's maybe a good time to talk about another book of yours, How Change Happens. Because nudge and sort of everything we've been talking about so far really, I think, is behavioral economics and thinking about individual decision making, right? And deviations from rationality. But then there are phenomena that are more aggregate, collective action problems, let's say, which this book is about. And you mentioned social media. These are companies that operate at massive scale. There's a lot of concerns about maybe social media hasn't been great for society, whether we're talking about teenage mental health or political implications. There's some growing evidence, I think, pretty good evidence on the causal effect on deterioration on mental health. And then also some good experimental evidence on political polarization, right? So there's a sense in which these technologies, social media, has not been great for society, right? It's hard to quantify, but certainly we can point to negative consequences. Jonathan Haidt, I'm sure you're aware, has sort of been talking about this for quite some time. We have seen in Australia recently, there's a ban outright, right? So now we are very far away, I think, from the concept of nudge and sort of libertarian paternalism. If you take Australia in particular, that's an outright ban. That's kind of Becker, Stiegler, heavy-handed intervention, right? So this book, how social, when you go from the individual to the collective, like what's the core idea in that book and maybe more broadly beyond the book since you wrote it?
Okay, so there are three ideas that kind of ground the book. One is connected with the political point about social media, and the idea is group polarization. That if you have a group of people who are deliberating about something, the regularity is they will end up in a more extreme point in line with their pre-deliberation tendencies. So if you get a group of people who tend to think that Nudge is a good book, we like this book, after they talk to each other, they're likely to think Nudge is a fantastic book, we love this book. People become more unified, more confident, and more extreme. Now, in the case given, this is a very happy outcome where the deliberating group is enthusiastic about the book Nudge. At least I would think that's a very happy outcome. But we could imagine cases where the outcome isn't so happy and where society gets divided very sharply because people are living in echo chambers of their own device. So group polarization is sometimes an impetus for social change. Sometimes it's engineered by political entrepreneurs. In my country, the United States, the American Revolution was partly a product of group polarization, in which like-minded people spoke with one another and whoosh, let's get away from England. In the town in which I live, which is Concord, Massachusetts, that's where the American Revolution started.
Yeah.
The houses are, I live in one of those houses from back then.
This is like North End?
Well, it's called Concord. This is where the day the shot heard round the world was fired was April 19th, 1775, and that's about a kilometer from my house. And it was like a group polarization machine.
Between what groups are you talking
Between people who were skeptical of the continuing relationship between the colonies and the United Kingdom, England. So England, the king, and the colonies split, and people in Concord were talking to each other all the time. Maybe we need to split, we probably need to split. And then it became a movement, which we celebrate, but you could think of movements that are similar that one wouldn't celebrate, like the rise of Nazism. So the group polarization idea is how we often see very large-scale movements. In my country, the election of President Obama had a great deal to do with group polarization. Obama's a former colleague and friend of mine, and I worked on his campaign, and I saw it in real time. The election of President Trump also had a great deal to do with group polarization, as like-minded people speak to one another. So that's a social mechanism that often produces extremism. It can produce enthusiasm for Taylor Swift. Beatlemania was very much a group polarization process, even though the Beatles are genuinely great. So that's one idea. A second idea is informational cascades. So this is a rational model. I have a few things to say that complicate the rational foundations, but if you have people in a temporal queue who are deciding what to do, the first says, let's say we should join the Paris Agreement. That's a good thing. The second isn't sure, but is spurred to agree by virtue of the fact that there's this informational signal coming from the first speaker that gets the second to move to accord. Now we have two people who think we should join the Paris Agreement, then there's a third who, unless she has a lot of private information, will agree, and eventually the informational signal gets quite loud and people amplify the signal by which they've been influenced. And we can see with respect to cultural movements of multiple kinds, with respect to political movements online, informational cascades are happening all the time. Our book, Nudge, thank you for the kind words about the reception. I saw in real time there was an informational cascade. I hope the book, both of us hope the book is worthy of what happened, but there was an informational cascade from which it...
Herd behavior.
Yeah, it was herd behavior, clearly.
So those two papers, the theory papers, I think from 91, 92, one is from Abhijit Banerjee and Bikshandani. If I remember correctly, it was a long time ago I read those theories, but basically predict that actually there could be complete information loss after some point, right? Yeah. So society can end up in a very inefficient equilibrium where they stop listening to the individual signal and just follow the herd, right? So coming back to your book, did they end up in a... Do you think it was a good equilibrium or a bad equilibrium?
Well, one point about, there's a lot to say, those are great defining papers, but there's a lot to say about what's followed them, one of which is they tend to be fragile. So if there's an external shock, which shows, for example, that there's a group that was at one point as popular as the Beatles, almost, called the Dave Clark Five. They were pretty good. They weren't that good. Yeah. And there was recognition on the part of some brave people. They're not really as good as the Beatles.
Slight detour on the topic of Beatles. So you must be familiar then with the event when Beatles arrived in the US for the first time and went on Ed Sullivan's show. I think it was 1964. This was at the time the most watched television event in American history. And it's a slight detour. So me and Joachim Voth, another professor here, we talked about this why isn't there a great paper in economics on sort of the counterculture movement in the US? Sort of everything that happened in the 60s from a sort of cultural economics point of view. And we talked about, like, when Beatles arrived, how controversial it was politically, not because of the music per se, not because of the lyrics, but because of the way they looked. They had long hair. You're familiar with this, right?
Completely.
I'm sure. Yeah. And so we had this idea that, which led to a paper now, Images, it's revised and resubmitted in QG, which is, we should be able to see in yearbooks this phenomenon, this herd behavior phenomenon, and detect where did people sort of, start growing long hair. Because like up until 1962, 63, if you go to any random yearbook in the US, as you look at males, they had short hair, suit, tie. Extremely homogeneous, and we can quantify this. Like if you go to, Alabama versus like Massachusetts versus, Wyoming, there's no difference, right? And then something happens in the mid 60s, right? And we see this long hair. So this is a great fun paper, and so we study this sort of, if you will, the herd behavior or this cascading of sort of styles, and then we try to connect it to things like actually patenting and real lifestyle choices, right? So, not to promote my own work here, but
I love this. I'd love to see the paper.
It's sort of a cool connection there, I think. Okay, sorry, I derailed you. So that was the second, informational cascades, and then the third one was?
The third is preference falsification.
Right.
So that people have preferences that they don't let others know about.
Yeah.
So people might think, for example, that a regime is terrible or a practice is terrible. It might be, immigration they might think is terrible, but they think they're not allowed to say it. Or it might be that they think that sexual harassment is terrible, but they think they're not allowed to say it. And then once there comes a green light, you can see a whoosh of permission slips, and that can lead to unanticipated social change. And one idea that these three notions, none of which is mine, the preference falsification idea, the informational cascade idea, and the group polarization idea, lead to is multiple equilibria and highly unpredictable outcomes.
Right.
So that random shocks can generate long hair for lots of people, or Brexit, or the fall of communism.
Right. Yeah, so preference falsification is, I think it was Timur Kuran who coined that term. It's a very simple but powerful idea, I think, which, he talked about Eastern Europe, I think Soviet Union, and sort of why wasn't there a revolution? Like, why was it so stable, right? And sort of one idea is, well, people's preference, they like the regime, right? The other one is, no, everybody hated it, but because people are falsifying their preferences in the actions they take, I get no signal to kind of invalidate the prior that people are supporting the regime. And then you can have these random events, right, that trigger somehow a revolution, let's say. But there's a related idea in there, I think that's interesting, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. That goes back to, in social psychology, called pluralistic ignorance, which is this idea, the simple version of it is, I think I'm in the majority, I think I'm in the minority, but I'm actually in the majority, but the majority is silent, and so I can sustain beliefs that I'm in the minority, right? And so I think those two ideas are like very similar to each other, and they have been formalized by, do you know Roland Benabou and Jean Tirol's papers on laws and norms, which I think is a beautiful, paper, simple paper that very much influenced how I think about society, intrinsic preferences, social image preferences, and then the Becker-Stiegler kind of like monetary incentives. I've done some work with with Leo Burstyn, yours is Shark, a good friend of mine in Saudi Arabia, where we took this idea of pluralistic ignorance and try to think about, can that explain why so few women work outside of the home? Only 4% of women in Saudi Arabia worked outside of the home at the time. And we had this sort of crazy idea based on the theory. It's like maybe Saudi Arabian men, they have a lot of decision-making power. Maybe they're actually quite liberal, like or progressive, right? Wouldn't it be crazy if it's a pluralistic ignorance equilibria there? And we went there with this hypothesis, and we piloted, I think, for like 2 years. And we found and we measured in so many different ways, and then we had this simple information intervention where we moved behavior very rapidly, right? And so, making some connections here between like your nudge book and sort of social change, there's also, I think, here a link to, these are not just interesting concepts to think about society, but they can have policy implications as well. And here one policy implication was, at least for us, that you can move labor supply of women or labor supply behavior of women very cheaply, very quickly, right? How social change happens is something, I'm very passionate about as well. Coming back to social media, I know you wrote with Leo recently, I think it was in Wall Street Journal in October, an op-ed piece where you talk about this collective action problem, and you talk about why are people on social media, and especially children, right? What was the title of the how to get kids to give up social media on their own, right? So, but the point you're making there is not an individual decision. You talk about it as a collective action problem, right? Can you go into that a little bit? Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about 3 streams of research involving social media. So a few years ago, I did a survey of how much people are willing to pay to use social media outlets, and how much people would demand to give up use of social media outlets for a month. And what I found was that people's willingness to pay was very low, and their demand to give up use was very high. It was basically a 20-to-1 ratio. So the median for some social media platforms was that people pay $5 a month to use. They demand $100, 20 times as much, to give up. Now that super endowment effect, as I call it, that's the highest willingness to pay, willingness to accept disparity that I think has ever been found, and it's a mystery. So I have some speculations about it, but let's just notice that behavioral finding defies the Coase theorem, which suggests that willingness to pay and willingness to accept the same good should basically be the same. Okay, I think there's a reasonable speculation that the low willingness to pay suggests a judgment on the part of users that the welfare benefits of social media aren't very high. I think that's a good speculation. Okay, that's research stream 1. Research stream 2 is a finding that people who are off a social media platform for a month, having been given the required amount of money to be off, are less anxious, less depressed, more satisfied with their lives. On every measure of subjective well-being, they're better off. But then when asked how much they would demand to be off for another month, they'd asked for approximately 87% as much as they demanded before they had the good month. That's weird.
This is the paper by Gansko and co-authors?
It's the Alcott.
Yeah, Alcott, exactly.
Yeah.
And didn't they also, they became happier during the month they're off?
And yet they demand...
And then they still want to get paid to stay off.
They still demand money.
You would have thought,
they'd say,
okay, but why don't they realize...
They should say after a good month, they should say, we'll pay you. They shouldn't say you're going to have to pay me.
Yeah.
So that's an anomaly.
Right.
And I don't agree with what I think is the author's preferred explanation, where the author's preferred explanation is that they get some things out of social media use that aren't captured by subjective well-being. When I say I don't agree, I don't know that it's true. No. It might be there might be something else in the picture. And that's what we're about to get to right now. So Leo's work, and he and I with others are now trying to test this more generally across a wide range, is that there's a class of goods that people buy but wish did not exist. I call them Barbies. Because I think Barbies are a good that many girls buy but wish did not exist. So
Leo was not going to accept that, I think.
He doesn't call it Barbie, so this is an idiosyncratic naming. But my view, inspired by his amazing work, is that there is a large class of goods, funerals and weddings might be among them, where people are going to buy them in some sense, but wish they didn't exist, and that people are locked into an equilibrium which they can't change. I think it's a stag hunt game, and they can't change it on their own, or at least it's really hard. And Leo has data, and we now have much more data. Leo has published data in a great paper suggesting that, finding that Instagram and TikTok are what I would call Barbies, in the sense that people will demand a lot of money to be off, consistent with the first two studies. But if people are asked, how much would you demand to be off, contingent on everyone else in your community being off, they say, oh, then we'll pay you. So that's the cool finding.
Right. I think he calls it a product market trap?
A product trap. That's the term. Yeah, I prefer the term Barbie. His is more descriptive.
The Barbie the doll.
Barbie the doll
is a product market trap in your view?
It's a Barbie. Where what I'd like to do is make the term Barbie, at least among a certain class of academics, synonymous with the class of goods whose existence people deplore, but which people would buy if it exists. Now, product trap is a more responsible term than Barbie. So we're calling it in our joint paper, which was in the midst of production, we're calling it a product trap, and we're saying it's pervasive. Then there's an empirical question whether tattoos are product traps, whether Tinder is a product trap, whether Starbucks is a product trap. And these are all empirical questions. We have some data on it. I'm not going to spoil the surprise. But I will say that the general phenomenon of goods that at least some purchasers of would prefer an equilibrium in which those goods would disappear from the planet. That's a pervasive phenomenon. I'm thinking, as you talk about your great paper on Saudi Arabia, I know that paper. That's a star performer in my book. I love your paper. There may be a relationship between preference falsification and product traps, where
this is next level.
So
walk me through that. Can you walk me through that idea?
This is a speculation generated in our conversation. So the idea would be that people wish a product didn't exist, but don't say so because they think they are isolated in thinking that the product's existence is a bad thing.
Interesting.
And if they could coordinate with others and say what they really think, then there'd be at least some hope of achieving a new equilibrium. And that, you can think of that as implicit in the op-ed Leo and I did, where we talk about an app which he created.
Exactly, because this is interesting. I can't believe, first of all, super cool idea. It's kind of obvious now that you verbalize it. Because Leo, his view is basically it's FOMO, right? Think of children, I'm sure it can apply to adults. It's like they wish Instagram and TikTok didn't exist. But given that it exists, I get FOMO from not being on the platform, right? Like I want to hear what's going on. I want to be in on the jokes, whatever, right? So it's FOMO, and then he created the app NOMO to try to solve the collective action problem. I think you're proposing a complementary mechanism, right? Which is more in the preference falsification space, which is everybody seems to be raving about, everybody's taking actions on Instagram, right? So everybody must think Instagram is great. So everybody wants Instagram to exist. I don't. but I'm afraid to say, I'm sort of like a little bit like the Eastern Europeans, sort of, right, like living on the Soviet Union. Like I'm afraid to speak up against it. That's the idea.
Yeah, that's the idea. I'm doing a paper now with George Lowenstein about shame and perceptions of prevalence. And this, I think, is related, where the idea is that there are certain things that people are ashamed of, so they don't disclose to others. As a result of that, they underestimate the prevalence of the thing, as a result of which they become more ashamed, as a result of which they become more silent, as a result of which, and it's a spiral, where you can take your pick. It might be some physical ailment, it might be a mental health issue. The example with which we start the paper is that one of the authors, not me, I can truthfully say, though I'd say it even if it weren't truthful, consistent with the thesis of the paper, was for a long time unable to do what's done in a bathroom, was unable to do what men do in a bathroom, and it was a kind of phobia about doing it in a public spot, and he was very ashamed of it. And then he discovered late-ish in life that this is actually a thing.
Yeah.
And someone mentioned it at a party, and he thought, my gosh, it's a thing. I don't need to be ashamed.
Yes.
And that could be an example, or it could be any number of things.
Yes.
At one point, having been divorced would
Right.
qualify that, or having had an abortion or a miscarriage.
Yeah.
And this is the spiral of silence idea that we're exploring is not unrelated, I think, to self-silencing about not liking Barbies, where to say I don't like to go to funerals, or I don't like to be on Instagram so much. You might think you are unique, or at least unusual, and marking yourself as a weird person, whereas it might in fact be widely held. And that's what Leo and I are making that bet, that there are a lot of young people. I can say I have a 13-year-old daughter who's on social media a lot, and I asked her what's her New Year's resolution, and she said to be using the phone less. And I thought that was very cool.
Yeah.
Now, what was it about? It might be a pre-commitment strategy about planner-doer models, or it might have been a little bit about working with her peer group to overcome an equilibrium which most of them don't like.
So there's something, I think, extra interesting when it comes to children's decision making here. I mean, interesting, a bit tragic, let's say, depending on the perspective, right? Like, it seems that children are suffering from being in this choice architecture world with social media. But what conceptually interesting, I mean, because if you go back to the libertarian paternalism, I think it was not meant to study like children, right? Because children, almost by definition, the word paternalism is about, for certain types of people, you need paternalism by definition, like children, right? But with social media, we are now, because it was a free market, kind of like wild, wild west, we let children make these decisions, right? But then you can make the argument, well, parents are supposed to regulate the choice architecture for children, right? Like, neither should we need the state to go in and regulate this, like in Australia, right? So you must have thought about this quite a bit, like this extra dimension of children. Is what they did in Australia a good idea versus, let's say, more the less heavy-handed, sort of the NOMA approach by Leo's app, and sort of, I think, what you wrote about in Wall Street Journal, which is you didn't promote regulatory change there. So can you walk me through, do you see what I'm saying here? Sort of like, do we go in with the law, or do we just sort of change people's choice architecture a little bit?
It's a welfare analysis with the presumption in the face of empirical uncertainty in favor of freedom. So if you know that requiring people to buckle their seatbelts saves X number of lives, where X isn't small, and that buckling a seatbelt, once it becomes habitual, is either very low cost or costs less, then go for the mandate. So to require people to get a doctor's permission to use certain kinds of medicines, that's coercive paternalism, and it's justified on certain assumptions about welfare. And then whether a social media ban for young people is justified would depend on data. If the ban implements the overwhelming judgment of what young people themselves want, then the argument for it becomes very powerful. It's a little like restrictions on discrimination in some countries, where the discriminators think we want that restriction because now we can serve to everyone and make more money. But without the ban on discrimination, we kind of have to discriminate because our customers want us to, and the ban facilitates what we want to do. I would think there's a welfare question. This is associated with the question, when do you want to nudge and when do you want to mandate? And it would be, as a welfarist, I would think, what does the welfare assessment show us? And if we don't know yet, just as a longtime University of Chicago person and a student of John Stuart Mill, say let's give freedom the benefit of the doubt until we know we ought not to.
That makes sense. There is, I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but there is another idea about the role of the law, which is the expressive function of the law, which relates back to what we were discussing earlier about sort of, if we are in this equilibrium society where people aren't vocally expressing their preferences, the law can serve as a signal to people about sort of, and that is like a separate mechanism, right? So I think gay marriage, I think that's one interpretation is once that was made a law, people could sort of, there was a big majority in favor, but we were not supposed to express this publicly. But once the law came into place, sort of it becomes normalized, and now most people, it's like not even debatable, right? So, but we don't have time to go into. But I know you wrote about that in your book, how change happens, about the expressive function of the law, which is, I think, is a very interesting idea as well, that is a little bit underappreciated in the...
Yeah, the law can dissipate pluralistic ignorance. So if people think that most people think that something is terrible, or that most people think that something is fine, you can think of examples from Saudi Arabia. Once the law does something, even if it's something kind of cautious, then people think, oh, this is what most people think.
Right, exactly.
Or at least enough people to get the law. So in many nations, restrictions on smoking have been effectively self-enforcing, which is a surprise to many, that it's compliance without enforcement. So you have a restriction on smoking in public buildings, and you don't need the authorities ever to come in. People just stop smoking in buildings. And it's because smokers evidently think that people don't want them smoking, and they think, I don't want to get private, sanctions or distress.
Yeah, that's it. Smoking and drinking was one of the first, I think, experimental evidence actually on pluralistic ignorance for U.S. college campuses many decades ago. I want to wrap up on, if we had more time, I would do a deep dive into
Thank
this
you for
book.
that.
But, so it's a kind of a provocative title, what AI can and cannot do. And you start with the behavioral economics view of people and say, people have biases, there's noise. Let's think about how AI can help people. So it sort of starts with a, I think, quite optimistic view of what AI can do. But then there's this, I think, the chapter on what AI cannot do, and then in parentheses, not now, not ever, which I thought was thought-provoking, and there's a line of arguments in there that we don't have time to go into that I think are new, which talks about thinking deeply about uncertainty in the world and decision-making under uncertainty. But because we don't have too much time, maybe you can sort of give me the 1 minute or 2 minute summary of your view of how AI can help society moving forward, and maybe some of the limits or risks that you see around AI moving forward.
Okay, so do you know Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin? You know the song?
It's ringing in the back of my head right now.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good. So this book is my effort to do Stairway to Heaven. So you remember the beginning of the song, which is somewhat pleasing, a rock song, and it's kind of the heart of the song. It has the word Stairway to Heaven in it. That's the part of the book that says that human beings are subject to cognitive biases and also to noise understood as unwanted variability in judgment. And that certain forms of AI, we want to be a little careful here, but let's start reckless, will be free from cognitive biases because that's not how AI works unless the training data embeds cognitive biases. If you associate certain inputs with certain outputs, like people with certain conditions are likely to have heart disease, AI will tell you, test for heart disease, they probably have it. And we have data that AI outperforms human doctors because the cognitive biases that human doctors show diagnosing heart disease are not shown by algorithms, AI-powered algorithms. And this is also true in the legal domain.
Yeah,
so
judges
use...
Yeah, no, Sandelwell, he's done the
so you
work
know
with Jens
Sandel's work on
Ludwig
this.
and others.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a general claim about immunity from biases. So this is the Stairway to Heaven, the kind of happy part. And then there's the problem of noise, unwanted variability in judgment, which is kind of the unnoticed villain in some of the empirical papers on medical and legal judgments and why human beings are outperformed by AI. That human beings are not only biased, but also noisy. And this builds on work I did with Olivier Sibony and Danny Kahneman in a book called Noise.
Yeah.
So this is the celebratory part. But you know the part in the Stairway to Heaven song, it's my favorite part, where Robert Plant goes, they call me the hunter, that's my name. It kind of gets rothy.
This is where my memory is lacking.
You do remember it.
No, I do not remember.
Okay, it gets rocky and rough. It becomes a different song. And it's a more rebellious song. And it doesn't have the harmony and the sweetness of, and that's the part of the book that is more, let's say, more in a bold font. And the idea is that AI can't predict if I flip a coin what way it's going to come up. And if you ask large language models why, they will say it's random, which is not the right answer. And if you press AI, large language model will confess that's not right. The answer is
lack of data.
It's lack of data.
Yeah.
And so there's not enough data to know something so simple as how a coin's going to flip. Now that's I think a window into a certain class of problems, and Hayek was all over this a long time ago, where like how species are going to evolve over a zillion years. There are too many perturbations which we don't have the data ex ante. And so whether two people are going to fall for each other, whether there's going to be a revolution in country X, whether a new song by someone who isn't going to be famous is going to do well, these are things which in principle aren't knowable ex ante.
Did you, sorry to interrupt, one of the examples is love. And we could get into that, and maybe we could do connections to Beatles, but we don't have time.
Completely.
Did you reveal in the book basically how you met not how you met your wife, but the event that led you to marry your current wife?
I'm not sure if that's in the book, but it's...
It says, it's sort of a throwaway where it says like you're in Berlin or something, and you accidentally email like a group.
Completely.
And then this led you to marry your wife, and it's like...
Completely. I think everyone has a story like this, but this is a crazy story. So I was working for President Obama. He wasn't president yet. He was aspiring president. And a group of maybe 5 of us was supposed to do the foundation for a speech on the rule of law. And we'd done nothing with 3 days to go. And I wrote a very sharply worded note from Berlin to the 4 members of the group saying, isn't this group a disaster, as in worse than say anything? That was my... charming phrase, and by accident I sent it to everyone on the Obama campaign. and I was the most despised person in the Obama campaign for months. One of my friends in that group said, your own personal reputation is destroyed, but we do have to do the speech, so you should call Samantha Power. She's very good. You should have lunch with her and figure out what the speech is. And
Awesome.
that's how I got to see her, and I fell for her in approximately 2 minutes.
That's awesome. So let's wrap it up. So let's see if we can make a prediction here. 10 years from now, speaking of love and AI, do you think AI will be able to predict such an event, who you will fall in love with?
No. It may be able to say that, if you are heterosexual, you're not going to fall in love with someone of the same sex. I can tell you that right now. It may be able to do much better than that and say that, probability, but it's not going to be able to.
Not very precise.
Too many things are happening on the spot.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So thanks so much, Cass. I really enjoyed this talk. And, I hope you'll enjoy Zurich during your stay here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I love the discussion.
Me too. Awesome. Thanks.